Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing some San Jose Sharks trade rumors. And these are primarily circling around one particular player, and that is Sharks captain Logan Couture. And this has kind of been talked about over these past couple of months and perhaps picked up a bit of steam with the Erik Karlsson deal, because now Couture seems to be the next up on the chopping block when it comes to these longer-term, skilled San Jose Sharks players. We've seen Mike Grier not really have any sort of attachment to any of these long-term players. We saw him trade Brent Burns this past or last offseason. We saw him trade Timo Meier at the deadline of the 22-23 season, and we saw him just recently trade Erik Karlsson. And so the next most movable long-term contract that the Sharks do have is Couture, and that is because, well, Hertl, he kind of just recently signed, so you're probably not going to move on from him, at least not for the next couple of years. And then, of course, Marc-Edouard Vlasic's contract is more unmovable than a 50-ton boulder, so he's going to remain with the San Jose Sharks for the foreseeable future. But Logan Couture is the type of player who is still good enough to actually have and command some value on the sort of trade block, so to speak. But would this actually be a player that many teams would be interested in? Because if you take a look at his statistics for $8 million, you might not necessarily like the offensive production that you see. And you might also be thinking whether or not Couture's production was somewhat carried by the fact that Erik Karlsson put up over 100 points this past season. Are we expecting somewhat of a deflation from not just Couture, but from the rest of the San Jose Sharks roster because of the departure from Erik Karlsson, even if the rest of the forward group has improved over this offseason? Who's to say? But Logan Couture isn't just going to bring a strong offensive element to whichever team that he comes to, because he also brings a very strong defensive element. Now, this hasn't been as pronounced over these past few seasons that the Sharks have missed the playoffs. When your team is losing games, as a forward, you probably want to push the pace a bit and try to score goals, because that, at the end of the day, is what wins hockey games. You can't win by scoring 0 goals. And so it's possible that Couture has indexed more so offensively in these past few seasons, but back when the Sharks were actually a competitive team and making the playoffs, Couture was a very effective defensive 200-foot player, at times even getting some Selke votes. Not necessarily top 3, but he was certainly in the conversation multiple times. And so if he gets traded to a contender and can kind of settle back into a role like that, he could be a very effective two-way player for any team that actually picks him up. But on top of that, if we go back to offensively, yes, maybe during the regular season, you might not expect more than like 50 to 60 points, even if put into a position to really succeed. But where Couture really shines, and hasn't been able to do so these past few years, is in the playoffs. It has been proven multiple times that when Couture arrives in the postseason, his level of play rises by multiple levels. He goes from like a pretty good first liner to an elite first liner, getting up, times where back in 2016 he was like conversation for the Conn Smythe if the Sharks had won the Stanley Cup. And honestly, there were even some conversations of, if the Sharks lost the Stanley Cup, could he be a possible candidate for that award? We saw him in 18-19 also pull his weight for sure, even back in the early parts of his career, where you might not expect like a rookie or a young forward to actually be able to perform well in the playoffs. He did show up, and so that is where Logan Couture would shine, and being traded to a contending team would allow him to do so for sure. And then on top of that, we should also talk about the possible leadership that Couture could bring to a team. And while I don't obviously have any sort of inner locker room information, what can be said is that Logan Couture's captaincy managed to survive the transition from one coaching staff to another, from Bob Booner to David Quinn, even from up high in the general manager situation, from Doug Wilson / Joe Will to Mike Grier. The fact that Couture's captaincy managed to survive that transition is actually quite telling, because a lot of the times these new coaching staffs and these new management staffs will want to try and like sort of shake things up, get like a new feeling, maybe bring in their own guy and just sort of give captaincy to somebody else. But Couture, even if there were maybe a lack of a better option, he ends up keeping it, which does say a decent amount about what he can do for the team. And so any team could be pretty lucky to actually acquire a player like Logan Couture. Having said that, at the end of the day, is a trade actually viable? Because you will notice that while I talked about should the Sharks trade Meier and Hertl and would the Sharks trade Erik Karlsson, the question here is, can the Sharks trade Logan Couture? And honestly, the answer is pretty much no. When it came to Meier, Hertl, and Karlsson, they were kind of toss-ups. Maybe I was leaning more towards trade in the case of like an Erik Karlsson or a Timo Meier. But when it comes to Couture, I'm about 99% sure that the Sharks will not trade Couture over these next couple of seasons and perhaps even for the rest of his contract. And this isn't because I feel as though the Sharks are going to want to trap Couture or that he's not going to have any value on the market, but the real reason is that the Sharks can only actually retain on 3 contracts at any point. And for the next 2 years, they have 2 contracts locked in completely, Erik Karlsson and Brent Burns. And so by trading Couture, who still is on contract for multiple years, that completely locks them out of retaining on any other deal because they would obviously have to retain on Couture's $8 million for the next 2 seasons. This really hurts the values of players like Granlund, Duclair, Hoffman, Barabanov, LeBanc, any possible player who you were hoping to move at this year's trade deadline or at next year's trade deadline. You can't really do it when you don't have that extra bit of flexibility. Now, already just having 1 open spot is not optimal, but having 0 open spots is quite bad. And so actually trading Couture, you're not going to be able to find someone, except for maybe I will say if the cap goes up significantly in this next season and teams actually have a ton of room to work with, we're talking like $4 to $5 million, someone might want to take Couture's full $8 million contract, and that's also including if he has a really good season this next year. But at the moment, for sure, they cannot trade him. It's just not really feasible. This is really why, when it came to the Erik Karlsson trade, I thought you might as well go all out with how much salary you retained, because even retaining $1 on that contract was a big burden for the team, because that's 1 extra contract that they're now having to retain for 4 more seasons. And so at the end of the day here, can the Sharks trade Logan Couture? The answer to that, even if you might want to think it's yes, even if things could really work out detail-wise, it's probably no. Class dismissed.